Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. Really exciting initiative. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
So so how do I move them on though? Will you do that, or how do
Yeah,
I?
just say next or something. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about family life courses and intergenerational influences on health and well-being in later life, and mainly focusing on Europe. So next slide, please. Yeah. So we know that family has a very large effect on older people's well-being, both in terms of emotional and practical help. And so studies of older people show that they regard the family as one of the most important domains of life. And we know there are large differences in health and mortality by marital and fertility history as well as status. And that even in this day of, YouTube and Zoom, it seems that for older people, it's actually face-to-face contact is still very important. So studies from the US, for example, found that it was only actually physically seeing family and friends, which seemed protective against depression, not other forms of contact, although of course this might change. And there are associations too between living alone, few social contacts, and things like cognitive decline, which I will show you. And increasingly too, those who lack close family, they may need more formal services. So all of these are things which would suggest that how positive effects of family, but we must also remember that families can be particularly stressful, family histories may be difficult, and those accumulated stresses may have negative effects. But of course, in all this demographic work, it's extremely difficult to sort of unpick all of these influences because there are many other things that families have in common, genetic and environmental factors, which may make it difficult to unpick the actual effect of particular associations. And reverse causation. Quite often we find in studies that older people who get the most social support, which we think of as protective, in fact have the worst health, and that may be because they're getting that support because of their health problems. And we just heard this nice example from Danielle about a lab experiment, but in general we can't randomize family behaviors, and it's very hard to find kind of instrumental variables, all of which make unpicking these associations difficult. And now in Europe, I think one thing is the historical context is completely different from countries like South Korea, in that until quite recently, we've actually had essentially an increase in the availability of close family for older people. First of all, we had reduced mortality, especially among men, has increased the proportion of people who are still married, and meant age of widowhood comes later, although I will show you there are very large regional differences. And secondly, those born in the 1940s had very high rates of marriage and parenthood, uniquely so in the European context, and so they had less childlessness than either earlier or later cohorts. But this is beginning to change with those born from the 1950s having different types of behaviour, lower fertility again, and also these kind of behaviours we think of as associated with the second demographic transition. So more divorce, cohabitation, non-marital childbearing. But this context, I think, is very interestingly in terms of huge difference between perhaps the European history and the South Korean context, in that this slide shows the proportion of women at selected ages who had no living child. So this slide shows the proportion of women at various ages with no living child. So the ages shown are 70, 80 and 90, because of course some people still, their children predecease them. But the main influence on these proportions is fertility, whoever had a child. So we see in Britain, Finland and France, the proportions of women, older women with no living child, are lowest for those born in the kind of 1940s, and are increasing for later born due to increased childlessness again. But I think what is interesting perhaps is the historical context too, is that if we look at, say, women born in the 1920s, those cohorts also had very high levels of childlessness, maybe up to 20% or something. So the situation in European countries now of low fertility, increasing proportions with no children, it's kind of different in some ways from the past, but it's not completely unique. We have had this before, and we've often had a quite reasonable minority of people with no children. Whereas in Korea, it's the childlessness that you now have is sort of completely new, really. So this study by Hwang, which was published in Demography recently, shows the percent childless by age 40 by birth cohorts. And these absolutely tiny proportions until we really get to very recent. So although in Europe we may have got some historical experience of quite large proportions of older people who have not had immediate family in terms of a child, this is new in some other countries like Korea. And the next slide, please. And as I say, the other kind of behavior, which is now much more common in many populations, is this marital dissolution, repartnering, more complicated marital and fertility patterns. So this slide shows the proportion who'd ever divorced by age 55 for various European countries. And so in Sweden, we can see that this is really, which is often a kind of forerunner of patterns of behavior, demographic behavior, getting on for sort of half of those born 1946 to 50 had ever divorced. Of course, many of them repartnered, and there are now quite high proportions of families with blended children from different partnerships and so forth. And we still, I don't think, really know enough about how those types of bonds will play out in terms of support exchanges in later life. The next slide, please. So in general, we know that in European countries, there are important socioeconomic as well as regional differences in patterns of intergenerational support. And in general, the support from children to older parents tends to be associated with lower levels of education, parental need, more so in southern than northern Europe, but reciprocity is very important. But from older parents to adult children, this tends to be the more advantaged groups who are more likely to give downward transfers. But a very important negative influence on both providing and receiving support is having been divorced, particularly divorced man. And there are some differences between social groups. These differences between social groups are kind of less common in southern than in northern Europe. Next slide, please. So in our work, or much of our work, we've been looking how fertility histories and the availability of children influence health in later life. And these may be both direct and indirect effects. There are certain consequences of pregnancy and childbirth for women, costs and benefits of child rearing and interaction, and of course also important selective influences too. But a whole range of studies generally suggest that somehow parents of about 2 to 4 children have the best health in later life, compared with either the childless or those with only one child, or parents of large families. The next slide, please. So this is one example of this. These are looking at fertility and all-cause mortality at ages 45 to 80, using data from the whole Swedish population. And these are models which try to use sibling control methods to try and eradicate some of the bias in this. And all of these models, including, various levels of control, education, time-varying marital status, and so forth, also show this pattern of highest mortality among the childless, lowest among those with sort of two children. This is on the right-hand panel, and then higher again for parents of large families, and also differences by age at first birth, with high mortality for those with early childbearing. And of course, even though we try to use methods like the sibling comparison, a lot of this must be due to various selective influences. Next slide, please. And similar sort of pattern. This is data from SHARE from Europe, looking at depression scores and limitations of activities of daily living according to age at first birth. And we see that in general, disadvantages for women with very early childbearing. Next slide, please. And in other work, we've looked at the influence of fertility histories on cognitive function and cognitive change in later life. And these are using data from the English longitudinal study of aging. So we've got parenthood history and control for a range of factors: education, wealth, various physical measures of health, smoking, and also things like social isolation and social support. Next slide, please. And these models suggest that the number of children change in cognitive function by parity. Again, we see the sort of least deterioration for those with kind of maybe two or three or more children, and more deterioration for the childless. And this is hypothetically is probably due to both these selective factors, but possibly also to kind of less social interaction with younger people. Next slide, please. And we also have been doing some work now trying to compare Eastern and Western Europe and looking at the availability of children in terms of influences on depression. And this arose really because we hypothesized that availability of children might be particularly important in the former Eastern European countries, because there's much higher rates of widowhood. There's lower rates of childlessness compared to Western Europe, but also a lot more one-child families, and which might lead people to somehow regret their family building strategies in later life if they're reliant on one child only. And of course, the huge change in political and economic context with the end of the Soviet Union meant that for older people, their sort of expectations have not been borne out. A completely different context in which they're growing old. So this is an example of where uncertainties have sort of really happened. So we wondered then and wanted to examine whether children were kind of more important for mental health in later life in Eastern and Western European countries. So the next slide, please. Right, okay. So we use this analysis is based on data from the Gender and Generations surveys, and we looked at variation in depressive symptoms by partnership and number of children, country fixed effects models, and able to look cross-sectionally at quite a large selection of Eastern countries, and the Western ones, Belgium, France, Norway, and Sweden. Unfortunately, fewer longitudinal data available. Next slide, please. So the kind of headline results were level of depressive symptoms among older people much higher in Eastern than Western Europe, and lots of studies have shown this. Unpartnered had more depressive symptoms than the partnered, and this was a stronger effect in Eastern countries. And as you might expect, financial strain, worse physical health were also associated with depression. Education was protective. And in Eastern but not Western countries, childlessness and having only one child rather than two or more was also associated with more depressive symptoms. And in terms of the longitudinal work, parents who had infrequent contact children with their children had greater increases in depressive symptoms. So next slide, please. So this is just an illustration of these findings. This shows the predicted number of mean depressive symptoms by partnership status and number of children, and this is for older people. And you can see that the East, which is the red colour, levels of depression are higher, both among those with a spouse and those not living with a spouse. But the relationship with number of children is stronger in the East, with the most highest number of depressive symptoms among those with no children. Next slide, please. So, of course, one potential way in which family exchanges of support are maybe operationalized is through co-residence. And in much of Europe, this isn't nearly as common as in other parts of the world, of course, particularly Asia. But even so, co-residence is an important sort of element of intergenerational exchanges, and it's becoming maybe becoming more important again after a long period of reductions in co-residence. And co-residence might have positive or negative effects on later life well-being, and partly because of the differences in the circumstances that lead to co-residence, and partly perhaps to different social contexts and availability of non-family support. So potential disadvantages are reduced autonomy, possible conflict, but benefits may include companionship, economies of scale, and of course there are important influences or interactions, if you like, with housing and some environmental benefits of more co-residence. So next slide, please. So this shows results from an analysis of the European Social Survey, looking at outcomes like happiness and life satisfaction. And in this study, we examined associations between these outcomes and co-residence for widows aged 65 and over. And what it shows is that in general, widows living with a child are happier than those not living with a child, who are basically living alone. But in Eastern and Southern Europe, it was only living with a daughter which had this beneficial effect. So this may obviously be something to do with what daughters do rather than sons do, but also the pathways that lead you to be living with a son rather than a daughter. Next slide, please. And more recently, we've been examining the effects of either children moving back to live with parents or parents on the welfare of both the older and the younger generation. So in some work in European countries, we found that when an adult child returned home, it was associated with a decline in parental quality of life, but this was mainly driven by effects in Nordic countries. And other things, and this is very much following on from Elder's concept of linked lives, things that happen in the adult child's life have an effect on the parental well-being. So children who experience divorce, their older parents' quality of life declines as well. So, and in further work, Marco Tosi looked particularly at Britain and found that this sort of negative effect on the older parents' well-being of the child returning home was generally fairly short-lived, except where the child was unemployed. Next slide, please. So this is just this illustration of what happened to parents' quality of life when the adult child return home, which, as you can see, is particularly a negative effect in Nordic countries where there's strong norms about sort of independence, if you like. Next slide, please. So more recently, we've been looking at what happened to the young people's mental well-being when they return to their parents. And this is becoming, in many European countries and the US, I'm not so sure about Korean context, there's been quite a big increase in proportion of young people living with parents and delays in all kinds of traditional markers of adulthood. So later home leaving, later partnership, later, and of course in some cases no childbearing. So if we can see that 2018 to 19, the proportion of 19 to 29-year-olds living with their parents is higher than it had been in the late 1990s. And illustrate this is that of young adults living with their parents, they're quite a high proportion have got some mental health problem, much higher proportion than among young adults altogether who are not living with their parents. Next slide, please. So in this work, we wanted to look at what effect does it have on the young person's well-being when they return to the parental home. So we use data from a large longitudinal study of the UK population. We've been able to follow these people from for about 10, 11 years. And during this period, about 15% of adults in the age range 21 to 35 move back to the parental home at least once. So it's quite a high proportion. Next slide, please. And we were expecting that these young adults who had to move back to their parents or chose to move back to their parents would experience a deterioration in their mental health. We looked at changes using fixed effects models. And of course, we did find that things like poor mental health and partnership dissolution increased the chance of returning to the parental home. But when we looked at changes in young adults' mental health, if anything, we found that it improved when they returned to the parental home. Next slide, please. So this is just indication of this. Sorry, could you advance that, please? Because next, yeah, that's it. So these are measures of mental health using the General Health Questionnaire and the MCS. So for women, these young women who returned to the parental home, if anything, their mental health improved a bit, although no changes for men, but no deterioration. Next slide, please. So, right. So to try to come to some conclusion, and I apologise that I wasn't able to show the slides myself, which has rather kind of slightly disrupted my presentation. Family life courses and living arrangements are major influences on health and well-being in later life, and intergenerational relationships and exchanges are important for both older and younger people. Things that happen in one generation affect the well-being of other generations, but there are these very important contextual influences as well as variations between different social groups and between different regions. And I think that perhaps the sort of biggest issue that we have now is that in Europe we have there's kind of quite long experience, if you like, of older people who haven't got their own children, but in the past may have had more availability of things like nieces and nephews. Whereas in countries like Korea, this is perhaps a kind of newer experience, and it's be unclear about the alternative kind of sources of support. And I think also that these things show that when we think about, say, young people's fertility choices now, this will affect not just their future, but also the well-being perhaps of their own older parents, who, whether or not they have grandchildren, may influence their well-being. And that it does seem that we heard from Danielle that this important influence of uncertainty, but of course in the past having children might in some ways have been an insurance against other types of uncertainty, and might lead to people to regret their choices later, whereas we don't know, it seems now to be a rather different context of decision making around the world. So thank you very much, and that's my end of my presentation.